Oregon football has resumed spring practice in Eugene, and we got plenty of updates from head coach Dan Lanning. We're going to be breaking a lot of those down and more on today's episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. And we're back like we never left. Oregon fans, what's going on? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. In case you're new here, I'm your host, Max Torres. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe wherever you're watching or listening. We're coming to you on YouTube at Oregon Football Max Torres. Always appreciate the support and any feedback. Love interacting with you guys in the comments. I'm not rolling solo on this episode. I got my guy Spencer McLaughlin from Locked On Ducks back in the building, and he's going to help me break down some of these newest updates from Lanning. How we doing, man?
Yeah, we're doing well. Glad to have some semblance of football, back for the Ducks, and we're going to have like on the field football action later this month with the spring game. So it's an exciting time. We're, moving in that direction at the very least.
It is absolutely an exciting time. I'm in Long Beach and just got finished doing a lot of recruiting stuff at a camp recently, but thanks to technology, I can dive back into Duck football and getting the latest updates there, talking to people around the program there. But we got our first update of the show. A number of new faces have joined the Oregon football team as the Ducks resume spring practice in Eugene. I'm going to go ahead and run through each of the names, and then we can just kind of talk about some of our thoughts and maybe where we think they can add some value. We're going to talk about some of the transfers in like kind of a different section, but 6 new players. We got Solomon Davis, the cornerback from Southern California, Charter Oak in Covina. Then you have Jerry Mixon, the linebacker from the San Francisco Bay Area. Shout out. As you guys know, I'm a Bay Area native, so definitely took an interest in Mixon. I think he's an awesome talent for the Ducks. You have safety Cody DeCambra, safety Trey Johnson, who comes over from Ole Miss. And then you also have a bit of an intriguing guy, Matt Rush, a walk-on quarterback from Washington University in Illinois. And then a long snapper in Colson Brunner from Central Washington, I believe. So those are some of the newest faces that we saw out there on the practice fields in Eugene, and I think that there should be some good additions, especially in the secondary. That's one of the areas that where Oregon needs the most help heading into 2023.
Yeah, I think Mateo Uyunglele is also a face who's here for spring football. Haven't seen Dan Lanning get asked about him yet or talk about him, but the first quote that we hear about Mateo, I imagine, is going to send some vibrations throughout shows like yours and mine that cover the Ducks consistently, because I'm awaiting to see what's he going to be. Is he a high impact true freshman? Is he a little bit more developmental than we thought? Like I don't know, because we haven't seen it yet. But yeah, secondary is a big issue of need, right? I mean, you're losing Christian Gonzalez from the cornerback position. That creates question marks because there wasn't a solid number 2 corner in terms of playing time last year. It was a revolving door. It was mostly Christian Gonzalez and Triquez Bridges, but Dante Manning was in there a lot. Is Jaleel Florence going to make a step? I thought Florence showed a lot of potential in his freshman campaign, and we'll probably be seeing the field pretty heavily. But you could argue there are even more questions about the safety position just from a production standpoint. Like I kind of know at this point, what to expect from Triquez Bridges at corner, Dante Manning. Not quite Jaleel Florence because it's still early in his career. Kyrie Jackson, I guess we don't know. But the safety spot, man, this could go like 8 different directions because you have 2 starters back from last year, but you have 2 guys coming in as transfers, Evan Williams, Bennett's brother, and Trey Johnson, who you expect to be starters. So does that mean that the 2 guys who were starters last year are getting bumped down the depth chart, or are they going to move positions, or what's going to happen there? Is it going to be more of a rotation? I really don't know. So Jamal Hill's been rumored to be maybe getting moved to outside linebacker. I think that'd be a great fit. I think he's a solid player. I think he's big enough to be linebacker. Doesn't quite have the high end speed to, keep the cover from getting blown off the top of the defense on the back end. So there are a lot of different moving pieces here in terms of where it can go. And Lanning talked about that a little bit as well, saying Trey Johnson is a guy who can play that nickel safety role or star safety, if you prefer, whichever one's the same position. And, but he could also move around. So I'm fascinated to see how this depth chart shakes out.
Yeah, we'll talk more about Johnson in the next segment, but just kind of wrapping up a little bit of some thoughts on the non-transfer guys, if you will. Solomon Davis coming in that corner room. I don't think he's a guy I expect to necessarily contribute early, but like you said, you kind of know what you have if you're Demetrius Martin with Triquez Bridges and Dante Manning. So I feel like this room should be wide open in terms of from a competition standpoint. I mean, I think those guys are obviously going to be in the rotation. I'm not saying they're going to get benched or anything, but just you haven't gotten a lot of high level play from those two guys, and that's what you need, especially with Christian Gonzalez leaving. So I think Solomon Davis, if nothing else, he'll help with the competition there. You also have Cole Martin, who was already on campus. I was a little surprised that Dalen Austin wasn't on that updated roster. Because some of the sources that I had talked to told me that he had already graduated. So we'll have to keep an eye out and see if he ends up joining this team. But that competition should be wide open at cornerback. Jerry Mixon is the only true linebacker at a high school that they signed in 2023. And when I went on the road to Sacred Heart Cathedral out in San Francisco to cover Mixon in person, talking to his coaches, he's a guy who does a little bit of everything. He played that true backer, put his hand down in the dirt a little bit, kind of rushed off the edge, played some quarterback, played some running back. So this is just kind of, I wouldn't say a jumbo athlete like Noah Sewell, but just a serious athlete that can do a little bit of everything that you need. Again, because of the transfer additions that they had at that position, Justin Jacobs, Connor Soley, I don't anticipate to see Mixon involved too terribly much. But maybe the last guy we can talk about in this segment, you have something
one quick thing on Sully, the Arizona State transfer. Also interested to see whether or not he is a major player. Number one, wasn't a super highly sought after recruit, not a super highly rated transfer, but he could be a guy who could back up Tyshim Johnson at that nickel safety spot potentially, because he's kind of that hybrid body type, safety, / defensive back and linebacker, which is what you're looking for typically at that star safety spot. So I'm most curious to see where he ends up playing.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, he was a former safety, so before he played linebacker at Arizona State, so he has some of that flexibility, that versatility that you want. But I think the guy that kind of drew some attention was Matt Rush, the transfer quarterback from Washington University, because I don't know if I'd said it on your show or if I had discussed this with you, but I was of the mindset that maybe Oregon did need another quarterback, because that depth behind Nix is, I don't know. I don't want to go as far as saying non-existent, but it's not promising. And I'm not trying to take shots at Ty Thompson or Austin Novosad. I'm just saying you don't have a proven guy who's done something for you in games, let alone big games, that you can turn to. So I think this is kind of a low risk, high reward guy, because Rush isn't your typical walk-on guy. I mean, he played basically 2 seasons at Washington University. And he threw for over 5,000 yards, 54 touchdowns against 10 interceptions. So I really like this addition by Oregon, because you get a guy who has experience playing football, playing college football, albeit not at a super high level, but you just want to give yourself another option, because if Bo Nix goes down, this team's in trouble.
Yeah, and I think it's similar to whoever the number 4 quarterback was last year. I think that they added at one point in time who had gone to the same high school. Yeah, I think it was Van Dyne. Didn't Van Dyne? I don't remember if it was him or a different name that came through the quarterback room at one point in time. But I remember talking about someone on the show who, on my show, Locked on Ducks, who had gone to the same high school as Andrew Luck and had like rivaled Andrew Luck's passing numbers in high school. So you find these guys sometimes who put up gaudy college numbers and, serve as a depth chart piece there. But I think, the most valuable thing they can bring to the table is being a scout team quarterback, right? Is, being someone who the defense has to be wary of, who the defense is, not able to take lightly or make plays they know won't be actually there in the game. Because I can't think of a season in which Oregon or any program really has had to go down to their 4th string quarterback. I mean, Ohio State, in that national championship season when they beat the Ducks after we trounced Florida State in the Rose Bowl, they were down to their 3rd string quarterback. But I've never seen it go down to 4. And look, they could be bringing him in thinking he might be more game ready should the worst come to pass, which is Bo and Ty getting hurt. And Austin Novosad is just not ready to do that. And I think based on what we've seen from Novosad, that's a fair assessment if you're Dan Lanning Will Stein and the rest of the offensive coaching staff. So I understand it. I think it's fine. I don't think it's a groundbreaking move or anything of that sort. So I think his numbers kind of get people all, riled up about, oh man, he did this or he did that. Like he's he's number 3 on the depth chart at best. Probably my guess would be number 4 as a walk-on, because a walk-on has to do a lot at the quarterback position, especially to overtake a scholarship guy on the depth chart. So I don't think this is a reshuffling of the quarterback room or anything. It's still Bo Nix, Ty Thompson, and it's probably Novosad 3, and then he's sitting there at number 4. But it's an addition, and you never know. You never know what could happen there.
Exactly. I feel like it was one of those kind of maybe underrated or low flying additions that we just wanted to talk about. Maybe I'll grab some attention. So Matt Rush, new quarterback added to Oregon's roster.
Good name too. Good name.
Definitely a good name. Let's dive into the transfers. We're going to kind of hit on each of these guys, some of the newer arrivals, I should say. Let's talk about Trey Johnson. He's a safety who comes over from Ole Miss. We kind of know the story with him, originally out of the Philadelphia area. I was hearing, I think on the Odds and Audibles podcast, that he was originally recruited to Ole Miss as a corner. So you see that coverage ability, guy who had 70 plus tackles, I believe last season for Ole Miss. And then let's read the quote from Lanning that we got at yesterday's presser, just talking about what made him an appealing guy at Ole Miss. And Lanning says, I quote, "A guy that's around the ball, makes a lot of plays. I don't think we have to look at him exclusively as a nickel. Think he's a guy that has position flexibility that we can use at multiple positions. He's a playmaker, plays with great effort, physical tackler, and has blitz ability." So this is a guy I feel like it's almost kind of like, a ball of clay. We haven't seen him play at Oregon. We know that Dan Lanning's defenses have, been multiple, a lot of different things you can do there. And I think I can't help but going back to your point that we talked about a little bit earlier, this gives Oregon some flexibility to move a guy like Jamal Hill to an outside linebacker, or at least try him, right? That's what spring football is for.
Yep.
And like I've kind of been saying, that safety room is crowded, and you have a lot of guys who maybe haven't done amazing things for you necessarily. So that's why I feel like Evan Williams and Trey Johnson come in and they project to be instant impact guys that are at the very least going to be in the rotation.
Yeah, I think Dan Lanning, Demetrius Martin, Tosh Lupoy all saw what we saw in 2022, and that's that there just were not a lot of big plays made from the safeties, right? Outside of Brian Addison, who, I talked about on Thursday's episode of Locked On Ducks as being a guy who is probably going to end up being a starter because he's the most physically gifted guy in that room. Like, he's the most explosive athlete, but he also made the most plays. Like, if I asked you right now, Max, think about a big impact play from a safety that is currently on Oregon's roster from 2022. Can you give me any outside of Brian Addison? I got one.
That's the only one that I can really think of. Maybe a couple of pass breakups.
There was a pass breakup from Steve Stevens in the back of the end zone against Cal that saved you 4 points as a defense, forced them into a field goal instead of a touchdown. That's it. And that's just not enough in an age of football where people are throwing the ball so often. Like, you need guys who are not just solid, but who are playmakers, who are having impact moments over the course of a game. And I think Addison could frankly play. I don't know if he could do the nickel safety because that player's typically closer to a linebacker. He's a little thin, but he's so explosive. I mean, he is a really, really dynamic athlete. And he had an interception in the Cal game. He had one pick, almost 2 in the UCLA game. He had some really nice moments against Washington State where he laid the lumber a couple times. Like, I just watched him throughout the year and thought, yeah, that guy belongs on the field. That guy looks like an explosive, high-level Power 5 caliber playmaker. And I think, the year in the safety role, he can only get better at that position. But all the other spots, you look at Steve Stevens and Jamal Hill, and you say, were there any impact plays? Like, there are plays, they accumulated stats, but there weren't those moments that made you go, wow, I really need to have that guy on the field. So I think that's why you bring in Williams and Johnson, because you see them as guys who can be more impact players for the safeties group on this defense, which does have a lot of names in it. There's those two. Damon David is in there. He was a 4-star recruit. It's just a bunch of 4-star recruits, basically. I think JJ Greenfield was a 3-star, but Now you've
Trey
got,
Williams.
yeah, Trey Williams is a redshirt freshman. He redshirted last year coming out of Jefferson High School in Oregon. He hasn't played. You've got Tyler Turner, Cody DeCamera, the 4-star true freshman coming in. Probably won't see the field early in their careers, I would guess, but hey, you never know. It's
Maybe
not
some
like,
special teams.
yeah, maybe some special team stuff and late game action against like Portland State and Hawaii, and hopefully a couple conference games as well where they get that sort of opportunity. But the defense just didn't have enough playmakers back there. And look, Bennett Williams takes a lot of flack from Oregon fans. I get it on some level. It's overblown at another level, but he had some really bad moments. And Trey Johnson, I think, is the guy who fits that role the best, right? To be that kind of box safety, just smaller than a linebacker. That's kind of what the nickel or star safety is supposed to be. That's what Bennett Williams was. But, Lanning talking about his versatility gives me optimism because I look at Bennett Williams and say, okay, from 15 yards and in, he was actually a very good football player. He was a really good tackler. He was good in coverage in that area. And he was a solid blitzer too. He forced a fumble against Arizona on Jaden DeLora that stopped what was an otherwise promising drive. But once you went beyond that, he just lacked the speed to keep up with wide receivers. And that's where Johnson has to be able to make a difference. That's where he's got to be better than Bennett Williams for this Oregon defense. Because anytime Williams was over the top, whether it was twice in the Washington game for long touchdowns, or I think it was once against Colorado as well. He had a blown coverage. He and Gonzo weren't on the same page. And there was one other one, North Carolina was the other one in the Holiday Bowl, where you just see him out there and you're like, oh, he's just a step slower than those wide receivers. That's what Johnson needs to be able to bring to the table is, look, I'm not expecting to be perfect in coverage all the time, but you can't be giving up these long touchdowns on explosive plays because it looks like you're just not fast enough to keep up with those wide receivers. And he's a guy who probably does do his best work based on what we've seen from him so far in his time at Ole Miss around the line of scrimmage, but he needs to be able to bring that deep element as well, or Oregon's defense, will be playing with one hand behind their back sometimes with certain coverages.
There's another transfer, a big transfer that we got to talk about for the Oregon Ducks, and that is former South Carolina edge rusher Jordan Birch. Plain and simple, Spencer, the Ducks could not get after the quarterback last year, and Jordan Birch is going to play a big role in that, but also just being crucial to Oregon's overall defense in 2023. And Lanny had some good stuff to say about him on Tuesday as the Ducks returned to practice, saying, quote, "You talk about changing a defense. It starts with having guys with great size up front that have the ability to play and have played at a high level. Jordan's done that. Obviously, there's a relationship there before, but really excited about what he can do for our team. He has a demeanor about himself. I think when you see him at practice, you see how he moves, you say, okay, that's what it's supposed to look like." So pretty good, initial return on one of Oregon's biggest additions as this roster overhaul continues. 6'6", 275 is what Birch was listed on last year. He just gives Oregon a guy that they haven't really had since probably Jason Jones. If you're just looking at physically, Jason Jones was massive. Didn't do a whole lot at Oregon. Kind of looked like he was getting more comfortable towards the back end of the 21 season. Now he's back home in his home state of Alabama playing for Auburn. But I'm really excited about this because Jordan Birch, I think Oregon's not in a situation where they have, just one guy or two guys to build around. Now you have Jordan Birch. Now you have Brandon Dorlus, Casey Rogers, Popo Amavai. This is probably going to be Oregon's deepest defensive line they've had in quite some time. And, Jordan Birch is going to play a big part of that.
Yeah, and he has to because he's a guy who can generate pressure on the quarterback. And look, you're talking about Oregon football and men's basketball, the biggest things they didn't do in 2022. Basketball couldn't shoot, football couldn't get after the passer. And if you can't do those things in the modern age of sports and the way they're played and how analytics work and everything, you are going to struggle mightily. And they did. So when you look at a guy like Birch who can line up inside or outside, but I think is best as an edge prospect, that is exactly what Oregon needs. Like they need a guy who can go out there, who can dominate, who can attract defensive attention, take some away from Brandon Dorlus, let him be an inside rusher. Because Oregon last year was so, thin on quality edge pieces that they would put Brandon Dorlus outside. And he can do that, but that's not really his body type. That's not really his game. He's not a speed edge rusher. He's an inside moves, uses hands to get around the offensive guard and bat passes down kind of guy, right? As a defensive tackle. Like that's where he projects in the NFL. Like there's no way Brandon Dorlus will play edge in the NFL. Like he is not even close to being quick enough to do that, but he can play on the interior of the defensive line. So if you have Dorlus there and Birch on one edge, and then what will probably be a combination of Mace Funa and Mateo Uyunglele at the other edge spot, that is just significantly deeper. And then you talk about the other defensive tackles. Popo is back. He was a first-team All Pac-12 performer in 2021. That's no small thing. And you've got Casey Rogers there, who I really like. Like he's just an annoying player for the defense. Not a great pass rusher, but a really good run stuffer. And then Sam Taimani is still in that room experience. You got body. So I feel really good about the defensive tackles. But, Jordan Birch, he's got to be a guy who helps lead the way to get more pressure on the quarterback. Because if you can't, then Michael Penix will have another 350, 400-yard day. And, you'll see other guys like Cam Ward just, feast on this Oregon defense. Because this is a conference in the Pac-12 that is the deepest at the quarterback position in the entire country. And I don't know that there's a close second, frankly. It's really, really good. Like Cam Rising, who 2 years ago was the first team All Pac-12 quarterback. He's like the sixth best quarterback in the conference now. When you have that level of depth, you've got to be able to create pressure or you're just going to struggle week in and week out to consistently generate stops. And that's what we saw a year ago for a number of games. Not all of them. There were some great defensive performances, most notably against Cam Rising, but against other guys, Michael Penix, Cam Ward. Now you've got DJU at Oregon State. Like you have to be able to make them uncomfortable and disrupt the flow of the offense.
And I want to get back to kind of what you were saying a little bit just about the depth and, getting after the quarterback. That was something that Oregon hasn't been able to do very well. And, Lanning was more or less saying that he feels like he has the pieces to do it now, at least the volume of guys to do it. I think Blake Purchase is another guy that's going to draw a lot of attention once he gets to Oregon. Everyone wants to kind of focus on Mateo as the face of the edge rushers in the high school ranks, but Blake Purchase, I think he won the state championship every year he was in high school. Two-time Gatorade Player of the Year, I want to say, in Colorado. And that kind of just leads into another point about kind of how the defense is maybe changing, or what the question was, what is the biggest difference, on defense from a talent perspective and depth perspective this year. And Lanning said, quote, "I think we probably have a lot more quality defensive line and quality DBs that can play. I'll be honest, from top to bottom, I think there's more that can play. The more players you can play, the better you're going to be on defense." And, Birch is obviously a huge part of that and the pieces that they've added. You got Mateo, who's fresh off a national championship with St. John Bosco. He's in Oregon now. But you also have Tavita Pomee out of Utah. He's an early enrollee that's there. Michael Gardner out of the state of Arizona. He's an early enrollee that's there. And then we talked about some of the DBs that they already added that are already there. And I think that those two positions were just addressed so heavily that, it's not only way you can go is up, but it's like you add these pieces and there's just so much promise and so much reason to be enthusiastic about them being able to turn it up a notch.
Yeah, and I think the only way you can go is up. I mean, it was a historically low pressure season and sack season for Oregon. I forget the concrete stat, but it was like their worst season getting after the quarterback in the last 20 years. And I think the Mario Cristobal turnover hurt that a little bit, maybe harmed their ability to find an instant impact guy out of the portal, or a true freshman, maybe, in the recruiting class that Lanning had to, salvage as best he could. And he certainly did for the 2022 cycle. But, the biggest names over there that Lanning was able to get were Jaleel Florence, who, decommitted, but then was down to USC and Oregon, ended up choosing the Ducks. Looks like a really promising defensive back for Oregon in the secondary. And Josh Connerly, who was like the big name that was standing out there in the 2022 cycle in the spring, got his commitment. He made an impact right away. Probably Oregon's starting left tackle this year. So I think that defensively, you saw Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoi load up on the D-line going forward. I mean, there are names that, are in this 2023 freshman class that you didn't even mention, right? Amari Washington, Terrence Green, Ashton Porter is a guy who, John Garcia of Sports Illustrated has said that, he's a recruiting guy, and he has said that Porter, he feels like, has one of the higher floors of any of the defensive line commits that Oregon's gotten. He might be ready to potentially contribute soon, but there are so many bodies in front of him. I'm not anticipating that, but there are just a lot of guys there because I think Lanning and his staff came in and said, okay, this unit is not good enough. That played out last year, and now they are addressing that problem both via the transfer portal with Jordan Birch, keeping guys around like Casey Rogers and Mace Funa, and going to the high school ranks and saying, we need to find our next great edge rusher, whether it's one of the guys we've talked about or Mateo or whomever it may be. So I like the focus from Dan Lanning and his staff on the defensive line because he's a defensive coach, right? And he knows you can't be a great defense if you can't get pressure with 4 guys. Like, you have to be able to do that. There has never been, nor will there ever be, a great defense that can't consistently generate pressure with just 4 guys. You're always, who are the most highly coveted players in the NFL position-wise? Quarterback number 1, probably left tackle number 2, and edge rusher number 3. Like, those are the positions that, and corner now is becoming more important with, the way that they're throwing the ball in the NFL. But, it's the Colin Cowherd model. You need to protect your quarterback, and you need to make their quarterback uncomfortable. And you do that primarily with edge rushers more than you do with interior defensive linemen. Like, Brandon Dorlus is really good, but Brandon Dorlus is not going to generate enough pressure on his own from the D tackle spot to be able to disrupt an offensive flow and a quarterback's rhythm. That's where a guy like Jordan Birch comes in.
Another big transfer for Oregon this offseason comes on the offensive side of the ball now. We're talking about Trey Johnson, who comes over from Troy and really enters one of the more interesting position battles that we have on offense, and that is at slot wide receiver against Chris Hudson.
Mm-hmm.
I've been kind of saying on my podcast when I was talking to, some people around the program that, about Trey Johnson, what's the story there? A guy comes over from Troy, not a big name school. The connection with Bo Nix is there, but he is pretty slight of frame, 5'10", 150-ish. And the feedback was, I guess, pretty straightforward. He's moving like guys. He's moving differently, rather, I think was the quote from the source, than other guys in that room. And that lends itself to, his speed and agility. And Lanning was asked about early return, some early thoughts on Trey Johnson, saying, quote, he's got speed. I think that shows up. He has the ability to get in and out of breaks, can really create separation with that speed. Obviously, he's a bit lighter, so we got to get him to continue to bulk up and gain weight for him to be a consistent player, because if you take a couple of hits at that size, you're not going to be able to be as productive, end quote. So I think that it's easy to get excited about Trey Johnson. Again, one of the more under the radar additions, I think, in Oregon's wide receiver room. And another smaller point, Spencer, that we heard from Lanning was he was asked about the wide receiver depth, and he was basically saying he's not tripping over it. Like, that was basically the thing he was saying. He's like, we've even played with less than we have now last year. So Troy Franklin's the main guy there. You get Holden as well. Trey Johnson, Jurion Dickey comes in the spring. I'm with Lanning. I'm feeling pretty good about this wide receiver group for Oregon, and I think that the spring game will probably be a pretty good indicator about where Trey Johnson ultimately stacks up in this competition at slot wideout.
Yeah, I think we can learn a lot about the slot receiver position in the spring game, because both guys I anticipate will get a lot of reps. They'll be the leading snap getters for sure, and I don't think there's a lot of competition behind them because, a guy like Jurion Dickey can play in the slot, but Jurion, correct me if I'm wrong, is not on campus yet. He enrolls in the fall. And look, he could be an instant impact guy. He could come in for fall camp and, kick butt, take names, and be one of the principal slot receivers. But I think he's closer to being in that Z slot behind Trayshawn Holden for the Ducks than he is to being in the slot receiver position. So I'm with you. I think corner and slot receiver are the most competitive and least decided battles for starting positions, because you don't bring in a guy like Trey Johnson, who was PFF's second highest graded receiver in the entire country. Now, yeah, he's playing at the G5 level, right? Like, he's playing in, what is it, the Sun Belt, I think. I believe Troy. I want to say Troy plays in the Sun Belt. I might have that wrong. Regardless, it's it's not as high level of competition, though. It's a respect. I mean, the Fun Belt. They've got some interesting teams in there. Coastal Carolina, Appalachian State, but that speed element that he brings, right? Lanning talked about team speed in the past, mostly with regards to the defense, but it applies to the offense as well. And I could see Tez Johnson being a better overall route runner than Chris Hudson, who's good at it, but I could see him being a more dynamic athlete in that sense. But here's the question, and Lanning touched on this. Is he going to be able to bulk up enough to where he can be out there in running and passing situations? Can you give him a fly sweep or a pop pass or a tunnel screen and trust that he won't, get clobbered to the point where he gets injured? I don't know. And we've seen skinny receivers like Devontae Smith have success at the Power 5 level before. So it wouldn't be unprecedented, right? But at the same time, receivers have to block. And Tez Johnson weighs less than I do. That is very, very small.
Talk about it, Spencer. Flex on him.
Yeah, let's just say my weight is not in muscle mass. It comes in other forms. But he's got to be able to prove that, number one, he can bulk up a little to take hits, and number two, that he can block at the level that Oregon needs him to. Because think about Bucky Irving, Max. What's his best move? It's the jump cut, right? It's suck the defense in and kind of LaMichael James style jump cut to the outside. Well, if you jump cut to the outside and your receivers, you got to have receivers who can block. Going back to LaMichael and Kenyon, who ran almost exclusively not exclusively, but they ran heavily on the edges, and they love to cut it to the outside. Those receivers, dude, they were kick-ass blockers. I mean, Jeff Mail plowed guys over. Tuane was a great blocker. Huff was a great blocker. They had Keenan Lowe. Like, you just go down the list. There have been a lot of great blocking wide receivers, and I don't know if Oregon has one right now. Franklin is
Johnny Johnson.
I think okay. Johnson was the guy I was about to mention. Johnson was a great
dog,
not
absolute
good.
Dog
he was a great blocker. He would take DBs and pile drive them to the sidelines like Michael Orr in The Blind Side. Like he would just drive them until the whistle stopped. And if Tez Johnson can't bring that to the table, but they think his route running is superior to that of Hudson, then maybe this is a true split. Maybe this is a true 50-50 snap count situation where, Tez is going to be more downfield, more of a downfield receiver guy, and Hudson will do stuff kind of within the confines of the first down markers. So I could really see it going either way, because I'm not low on Chris Hudson at all. He was a 4-star recruit coming out of college. He's been really productive so far. He had a couple iffy moments last year, but not a lot. Like, I think it's overall gets a bit overblown when people say, oh, well, he had the one drop. Okay, he had a bad drop against Cal, no doubt. Everything else, like, he made big plays. He caught tunnel screens. He's a good blocker. He does pop passes. Like, there are a lot of things that he does at a high level. And I just question whether or not Tez Johnson can surpass him on the depth chart. I could see him working his way into kind of a 50-50 split, like I said, but we don't know what's going to happen.
Well, we have to keep an eye on that wide receiver room battle, the slot wide receiver room position specifically. Spencer, we've hit on a lot of good stuff. I do want to be respectful of your time. I did have two more little subsections I wanted to get into. How are you doing on that?
Yeah, let's ride.
Okay, for sure.
I don't have a life outside of Oregon.
I feel like I don't sometimes, which is good and bad.
I wouldn't want it any other way, personally.
We don't have to go into that, our personal lives. But let's talk about Bo Nix, because going into 2023, you could say it was the same in 2022, but it's a little bit different. This is Bo Nix's Oregon team as we stand right now in spring practice, going into the 2023 season. And, Dan Lanning was asked about kind of what role, I guess, or, what growth he wants to see from year one to year two with Bo. And I thought he had a really interesting answer. So I'm going to hop into what he had to say. Quote, I had a long convo with Bo yesterday. There's a big difference with where he is this year compared to where he was last year. it was kind of earning the respect versus now he's earned the respect. Now it is. That leadership role is expected for Bo. Expect him to step up, and he has those traits. He's been that guy, but certainly you want the best from your best players. He's proven to be one of our better players, especially in this conference, in the nation at quarterback, and want to see that carry over to the field. So we talked about how, kind of this team will go as far as Bo Nix can take them. I think that's pretty obvious. But it's a little bit different now. He's rewritten the narrative around his name. He's no longer the Bo No kind of guy that we heard about a lot when he was at Auburn. He had a heck of a season and even played himself into the Heisman Trophy conversation at one point. But now it's going to be on Bo Nix to help Will Stein implement his system, to help get this new look offensive line up and running and gelling. And I think that he just takes on a new leadership role, and I feel like it was probably expected. He comes back for one more ride, and I think that the standard's been set, and there's sky high expectations for Bo Nix and Eugene.
Yeah, I mean, how can you not have anything but high hopes after he set an Oregon and personal record for completion percentage in 2022, his first season with the Ducks? And I think it goes to show that when you recruit a quarterback, he's got a lot of potential, right? As Bo Nix did, or as Austin Novosad does now, or Ty Thompson. What you surround him with matters as much as how talented the kid actually is. Because Bo Nix was a 5-star coming out of high school. He graded as a 3-star transfer, but he played like a 5-star quarterback in 2022 because he had a great offensive line. He had a running game. He had good receivers. He had good receivers at Auburn, but he didn't have a great O-line. He didn't have a running game there. But when you give him the pieces to succeed, he showed that he can execute the offense at a high level and still improve in some areas, right? I think there were still a couple moments where he got locked on to a particular receiver. I think getting through progressions is one of the biggest knocks on him as a professional quarterback prospect. But I think overall, he showed that he is capable of playing at a Heisman Trophy caliber level. It's not Marcus Mariota level, but the way that he uses his legs to allow himself to maximize his arm talent, I think the way that was schemed within the offense last year was really, really good. Like those sprint outs where you slant the O-line to the left, you leave the tight end to seal block on the defensive end, and then you sprint out on a naked bootleg, and you allow long developing routes to take place down the field. Those plays worked seemingly every time because Bo Nix has a good arm. Bo Nix has a strong arm, and he is very mobile as well. And when his mobility was taken away, Oregon's offense was limited as a result. And
totally different.
Yeah, and I'm with you that this is Bo Nix's team, right? His brother's on the team now. You have some key returners from last year, but a lot of key leadership departures. Most notably on the offense, I'd say Alex Forsyth was a huge, huge loss for the Ducks because he was a 6-year center. He's a vocal leader there, and Bo Nix has to take that role in stride, and he's got to embrace it, and I think he will, based on what we saw and the respect that he commanded of Oregon players and fans as well with his first season in Eugene. I think there's no reason to expect him to do anything less than, what he did last year and maybe even improve upon those numbers.
We talked about Bo Nix. Now we got to talk about the guys that are going to be blocking for him as our final segment of the show, winding down this episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. Appreciate you guys tuning in wherever you're tuned in, talking with Spencer McLaughlin of Locked On Ducks. Oregon's offensive line is going to look pretty darn new in 2023. A number of departures, most notably Alex Forsyth at that center spot, but a couple of important pieces coming back, most notably Stephen Jones, Jackson Powers-Johnson, Marcus Harper. You could also throw Faupe Laulu in that conversation. He saw a little bit of playing time last year, not a ton. Josh Connerly, got to mention him too in that 14J package. But we're going to wind down the show because Laney was asked about kind of what he's looking for along the offensive line, maybe more specifically at center as they transition from Forsyth into a little bit of a new era. And, in the question there from our guy, James Crepia, he was saying, Forsyth was unlike other centers. He was calling audibles. He was, calling out shifts, calling out changes, just an unbelievably cerebral guy, sky high football IQ. And now Oregon doesn't have that. So what is Lanning going to be looking for? And Lanning said, quote, ultimately, you let your players do what they're able to do, and you don't limit what their abilities are. Alex had grown over time to a guy that can make those calls, can make changes, identify things. We're not there yet. We don't have that necessarily yet, but that comes with experience. So the more experience we get, the more we can create opportunities to take advantage of what's in their tool belt. And the Ducks did add some really experienced guys in Junior Angelau from Texas and Ajani Cornelius from Rhode Island as the main transfer portal guys for Oregon along the offensive line. So you also have to, put into the equation here, Spencer, that they have Leak Terry and Mike Cavanaugh taking over that O-line. New group with Adrian Clem going to the Patriots, Vianney Telemaivau going to Stanford. You have not only a new offensive line, unit, but now you also have some new guys that are going to be coaching them up. So plenty of reason to be optimistic, but also, there's going to be some growing pains.
I don't think you can reasonably expect this offensive line unit to be as successful as last year's. It doesn't mean you can't expect them as an Oregon fan to be above average, because they do have some returning talent, right? Stephen Jones is in there. Marcus Harper will probably play at some point. Jackson Powers Johnson will be at a mostly new position, but he's a really talented offensive lineman. I mean, he's been really, really good for the Ducks. Josh Connerly as well. But they're going to be shuffled around and playing in ways that they didn't last year, right? Jackson Powers Johnson is going to be at center. I think, though we'll see how spring football goes, Josh Connerly is going to be your left tackle, but your full-time left tackle, not a run blocking and one-time pass catching left tackle, but a guy who is protecting Bo Nix's blind side. TJ Bass allowed some ridiculously low number of pressures while at left tackle. He was really good, and he's gone. Big Sala at right tackle had some ups and downs, but there were a lot more ups than downs. That looks to be a Johnny Cornelius' spot. At right guard, there was kind of a revolving door last year, right? Stephen Jones, Marcus Harper, Feope Laulu was in there a little bit, and then JPJ too. But you're going to be putting in a new guy in Junior Angelau, who's also got a background at center, but looks to probably be in that right guard spot. So I just look at the O-line and say, yeah, I see talent. I see some experience as well. But Cornelius is going from FCS to Power 5. He was a highly coveted transfer, so probably a good fit there. Angelau, I feel really good about because of what he's already done at Texas. But JPJ is going to be essentially learning a new position. That's a lot. Connerly is going to be learning a new position or a new amount of playing time if he's a starter. So they have above average talent compared to the rest of the conference, but you can't, it's so much about chemistry and working as a unit, understanding the calls and having a different center there. I just can't see how they don't take at least a little step back, which is still going to be okay because the offensive line was so good. They allowed one sack in the first 8 games while Bo Nix was healthy. Like that number was ridiculous. They allowed the fewest sacks in the country. So if I tell you they're going to go from allowing the fewest sacks in the country to, taking a step back, that's still like no more than, 1 sack every 2 games, essentially. So I think they can still be quite good. But can they be as good as last year? No. And that puts the onus on Bo Nix to be a better orchestrator of the offense, an audible caller without Alex Forsyth there, who did do that several times last year. That's been, I think, pretty well documented at this point. And also to just be a more vocal leader, even more so than he was, because you don't have Forsyth in the mix to be that. But I think he's got that sort of potential. But when you're making those jumps, when you're making those changes and those tweaks, it can come with some growing pains, like you said. And I think Oregon fans have to be prepared for that. And you just hope they don't show up in critical moments and they get most of the kinks worked out before conference play begins.
Well, a lot of great stuff here on this episode, Spencer. Before we get you out of here, let the people know where they can find you and kind of what you have going on in this football space.
Yeah, I host Locked On Ducks and Locked On Pac-12 on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts Monday through Friday all year round. I'm on Twitter at Smalls_55 is my personal account. If you ever want to send me a question for my show or just send me a message or whatever telling me that I'm a doofus, then by all means, go for it. Twitter mentions and DMs are wide open. But yeah, Max, always happy to come on and talk Ducks with you, man. Appreciate you.
Right on, man. Well, appreciate you for taking the time out of the day to talk some Ducks with us, and appreciate you, whoever is listening or watching this, for taking some time out of your day to talk some Duck football with us. You can lock in with me on all social media platforms, primarily Twitter and Instagram at mtorresports, that name on your screen, and then on YouTube at Oregon Football Max Torres. And then stay tuned, stay up to date rather with all my latest Oregon coverage over on ducksdigest.com. But until next time, thank you guys so much for listening to another episode of the Ducks Dish Podcast.